We're very lucky to have Dr. Robert Grudin here, who a few months ago finished off a book called Design and Truth, which, if you haven't read it, there are order forms, I think, on the way in. It's an excellent book. I've read it myself. He's an accomplished author. I'm going to read a few things about his biography, and then we'll let Robert begin with his reading. Robert graduated from Harvard and received a PhD in comparative lit from the University of California at Berkeley, where he now lives. He's a professor emeritus in the English department at the University of Oregon. Professor Grudin's literary explorations have taken him through a variety of literary genres, from an encyclopedic article to internet journalism. He's been credited with major contributions to 5 different publishing fields. Throughout his career, he's pursued the study of liberty, its genesis in the mind, and its implications in the real world. His work has been widely reviewed, and his many public appearances include lectures to professional societies in science, technology, business, design, government, medicine, education, political science, and creative writing. He was a Guggenheim Fellow in 1992 and 1993. And as I said, he's here to talk today about his book, Design and Truth. At Google, we think a lot about design, and so Robert's going to take us back to the roots of that idea and help us explore it a bit further. Robert's actually also a personal friend of mine. His son, Nick, and I went to graduate school together. This weekend, Robert saw his older son get married, and for the first time saw his first grandchild, so it's an exciting trip out here to New York, and we're glad to have him with us here today at Google. Robert, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Steve, and thank you, Google and Kate Clugston, for bringing me here. Just as a word of caution, the marriage and the first grandchild were 2 different sons. I've got 3 brief episodes to share with you today. One of them is a blog that I did about the book, and then there are 2 from the book. And then I hope we'll have time for Q&A. And the reason I chose these 3 is that they are all, in a sense, unfamiliar aspects of design. Until I started writing this book, I thought of design as I wasn't a professional designer. I thought of design as a profession, and I also thought of it as an art. When I started writing this book, I decided that design was also a philosophy, a way of living. And that's what motivated me through the course of my composition, and does so now. I'm now going to take off my hat, and the reason for this hat today is not the blinding sun, but that this hat has some relevance to what I'm going to talk to you about today. And it is a Polo Ralph Lauren, and they're not paying me. So first is the blog. You can find this on Powell's blogs by Googling my name and any big noun that I might use in the course of writing this. Recently, I read a blog by a writer who was in the course of a book tour. Those are the most boring blogs you can possibly read, by the way. I went to this place and gave a talk, and then I went to the next place. Well, anyway. It brought to mind a mini tour I'm about to make, and a few earlier ones, which range from the hilarious to the humiliating. And it also reminded me that the only menu item you can order with any confidence in all 50 states is ribs. Try something else in all 50 states. Writers in general are nesting wildlife, and as one of them, the most edifying book tour I can think of is the long series of nests that over the years I've built for the silent performances of my task. As I sit in this kind of crow's nest that I've set up in the Berkeley Hills, where I live now, where are you? Glancing now and then at the wall of rain coming in from the bay, I think back on 10 or so earlier nesting attempts, The most exotic is on Maui, a large room, windowed and screened on 3 sides, where I sometimes sit at an oak desk, writing away to the tune of screeching francolins. They're one of the world's loudest birds. Eloquent sparrows, confiding doves, the occasional thump of a falling avocado, which at my house get up to 2 pounds apiece, and the more or less constant ground bass of gas-powered leaf blowers from the neighbors' yards. But the 2 writers' nests that are most vivid in memory are the following. There is the academic jungle I set up in my University of Oregon office when I was doing research on a long article. And I had been assigned to write an article on the history of humanism. Now, I did not know the history of humanism, and why the board at the Britannica set me up to do it was that the little bit about humanism that I knew impressed them. I also thought back, and there was no scholar I knew, living or dead, who knew the full history of humanism. So I had a lot of studying to do. And I set up my writer's studio in my office. My office was 9 by 15 feet in the following way. You'll have to think back, perhaps, at the fabric picture hooks. You would have to lick them. Do they still have those around? Anyway, you have to lick them until you almost got sick to your stomach, and then hold them and press them against the wall. I set these up on the ceiling. And then, as I see from the audience, most of you will have to look back and imagine the early computer printers. This was late 1984, early 1985. And the printers you could buy then for personal use were all tractor feed. Now, a tractor feed right now would look very, very clumsy and extremely commercial. It did have some advantages, and that is you could hold a whole article or even a whole book together, and if it started falling apart, you could just drag it behind you like some kind of tail. Anyway, I would take my notes for this kind of research I was doing, which was major, thousands and thousands of words of notes. And I had a little ladder, step ladder. I had all these hooks on the ceiling, and I would drape the tractor feed over it so that I could multitask. That was my early way of multitasking. I could jump up from my seat and move from one hanging tractor feed set of notes to another as I was typing the article in. Well, the upshot of all this was that my office looked like a jungle with sheets of tractor feed hanging down. And the sides of the office were covered with books that wouldn't fit in my already full bookcases, so I stacked them. And fortunately, this accident didn't happen until I had almost finished the article. But at one point, when I was trying to readjust something, 2 or 3 piles of books came down on me from the ceiling, carrying with them a festoon of tractor feed. And I was in this pile of books and tractor feed on the floor. And unfortunately, I had a guest at the time, so I had to wave to him. Everything's okay, out of the pile. That's one way an author, at one point in time, designs his own nest. Okay, I don't have to read from this thing anymore. The second really dramatic thing had happened a few years before, and that was that I was on a sabbatical to write a book. It ended up being my book On Time, which was just a bunch of meditations. And we were forced from our splendid house in Spain back to Carmel Valley, California, where we had a medical emergency. We had everything worked out okay. We had a wonderful invitation to come to Carmel, and that had support from many, many friends on both sides of the continent. Found a little house in Carmel, and the only place I could write in this house was in an kind of alcove. It would have been the size of a small walk-in closet, except that it had a window. And I could just barely fit in. There was a table there, and I had a pen and a notebook. And it was perfect for me. I didn't feel the claustrophobia that I do now when I get into a room that small. I felt that I was completely at home because I was so fascinated by the book that I was writing, that the book had become, in a sense, my house. Now, just think about that. Think of a project that you have, an ongoing project, that is so absorbing that it, in a sense, becomes your physical world. Another way I could put it, and this is really specific to my book, is that it was a house of time. When you were on a long project and you're sort of in charge, or you have a major responsibility in it, the way every member of a team should in a well-working team, it becomes your own. It becomes something that you enter. It becomes a private room, or maybe a dialogic room, that you realize you can enter again and again. And you can call that a house of time. And it's an interesting way of looking at things that you do. Okay, if there's Q&A on that, save it for the end, because I'm not sure how long the next section is going to take. The next section has to do with building and restoring furniture. And designing and building furniture, very simple furniture, is the only design work, aside from writing, that I've ever done in my life. And now I'm going to take you even farther back in time to the middle 1970s, when my wife and I and our growing family were working in Eugene, Oregon. This is a section called the Baker's Table. I have a theory about social class that goes like this. No matter how much money you make, you are upper class if you spend less than you earn, and you are lower class if you spend more than you earn. And if you spend exactly what you earn, give or take $100 or so a month, then you are anxious class. My wife and I belonged to the anxious class when we were bringing up our kids. We worked hard and spent our monthly checks. The mortgage got paid and bread was on the table. A pre-owned car was always parked on the steep driveway of our hillside house, presumably ready to head for campus or take the kids to soccer. But ideas like buying a new car or taking a hotel vacation were simply out of the question. Buying decent furniture was also well beyond our means. But lumber was cheap, so I started building tables. And the way to start building your own stuff, of course, is not an apartment unless you have a loft. You need a little studio, you need a workbench. As it turned out, I found a Xerox of a design for a workbench that a friend gave me from Mechanics Illustrated. So I was able to build a workbench simply out of used 2x4s. So I got this workbench. I had a tiny basement that Nick and Misha remember well. I started decorating it with tennis posters, I put a vise, I bought a really heavy vise and put it on the workbench. And that's the very first thing to do if you're building anything, is to get yourself a vise, because it's like having a friend help you. And I got some simple power tools and started building stuff. I designed an oak baby changing table. I'm not sure anyone else has ever designed a baby changing table. Mine would not have worked because it didn't have any means of restraining a baby rolling off the top. So it was never used as a baby changing table. But nonetheless, it looked pretty good, I must say. It's all oak. I designed a coffee table, that's something we still have, and an end table, and had them assembled by the experts at a local wood shop. These were too hard for me to do at home because they required diagonal cuts, and I didn't have that machine. Have I since become a famous furniture designer with merchandise for sale at skymall.com? Not quite. But these tables taught me something. I realized that by designing them, I had turned impoverishment into an enterprise. I had transcended my own inhibiting academic world and briefly explored the material presences of daily life. I had freed my eyes and hands to converse with the varieties of shape and substance. I had engaged my little world and changed it. And that's what you do when you design and build something, or have it built. Ever so slightly, you change the world. For these reasons, there is something special for me about the practice of design. My tables brightened up the living room and had a general civilizing effect on the house. But we still had no dining table, and at a dining table I drew the line. My design talents did not extend to the gracious and the festive. By the way, in case any of you are interested, I can now design a dining table for a very modest price of a few $1,000. And in case any of you want one, just get in touch. Very unusual design, I'll tell you, but quite practical. That's where Bill and Duffy Baker came in. They lived very near us in a big red house, and they had a great big red barn behind it. They owned a few retail businesses in the campus village, including Duffy's, the saloon of choice for fraternities and varsity athletes. Bill had a thing about furniture. His house was crowded with antiques and handmade pieces, including a classy 4-poster bed. His barn was full of old stuff in various stages of restoration or decay. A gala garage sale at the Baker barn in the late 1970s coincided, as it happened, with my peaking anxious class frustration and the semi-annual lust to start making mischief with a piece of wood. When I told Bill that I needed a good dining table but could not pay much for it, he said, "Bob, I've got just the thing for you." And he led me back into the darkly stacked reaches of the Baker barn, on the way trying to sell me his spare 4-poster bed, which was this enormous thing. A ray of sunlight in back caught the object of Bill's search, and soon I stood looking at the massive oak table that would become, more than I thought possible for an inanimate object, our family icon for the next quarter century. And this is the table that still sits. I've had to redo it twice now, but it still sits in our dining room in Berkeley. By the way, the table was built in around 1900 at a factory in Fond du Lac. Where is Fond du Lac? Wisconsin or Michigan? Wisconsin. Where the furniture building, at that part of American history, a large part of the furniture building was done in Fond du Lac. The table was a daunting prospect. Most of the original finish was missing, exposing wood that was alternately dried out or stained. Patches of foggy shellac still clung to other areas. The 5 spiral-turned heavy legs, the middle one was to hold up extra leaves for the middle of the table, looked solid enough but would require hours of cleaning up and staining. There were no extra leaves, and one of the dowels, which was supposed to slide into holes as the table was closed, was broken off. But worst of all was the veneer top. Thumbnail-sized bits were missing altogether. Large areas of veneer, frayed at the edges and completely desiccated, had parted from the surface and curled inches into the air, as though in defiance of anyone brash enough to attempt a repair. And just imagine looking at that if you didn't know anything about furniture restoration. I said to Bill that it looked like a tough fix. "Piece of cake, Bob. I will talk you through it," he said, taking my $100. For the next 2 months, the table stood in my garage, getting attention. After much advice from Bill and my friend Bill Rocket and others, I turned the job of compelling the rampant veneer to sit down where it belonged. I moisturized the ancient sheet of wood very, very thin, until it was pliant but not soaked. Then I wiped off the liquid residue and pressed the veneer down in place on a bed of glue. I stabilized it with plywood, braced the job with a large cinder block, and left it overnight. This worked. It wasn't curling up anymore. It was lying flat the way it had been when it was built at Fond du Lac all those years before. When I removed the block and plywood the next morning, the thing in the garage looked like a table again. That afternoon, I picked up a small package of oak veneer and an X-Acto knife at the planing mill, lined up grain with grain, and cut tiny pieces in the shape of each damaged portion of the surface. Once in place, these were also glued and braced. Over the next few weekends, cutting a dowel, bleaching stains, removing old varnish, sanding, applying red oak finish, sanding again, finishing, sanding, finishing, I completed the restoration. No boredom in that job. Often at work, I was suffused with a quiet joy. The table was becoming a thing of beauty. I was bringing it back to myself. So here in the simple job of restoration, you have a new relationship to design because you're restoring the design of something that was past. You're bringing back the past. And with all of that in mind, I'd like to recommend to you Eric Sloane's marvelous series of books on antique wood, furniture, barns, and tools, which he illustrated himself. And that's Sloane with an E on the end. He wrote some of my favorite books that I'm always looking for to reread. Not that I wasn't bringing things back to me. Restoring beautiful and useful things with the past, particularly items of family use, is about as close as we can get to restoring the past itself. The feedback is little short of spiritual. As I lavished care on the table, I was taken back into the world of my earliest memories, when in my grandparents' dining room on Hughes Street in Brooklyn, my head had gained enough altitude for me to notice that the big cherry wood dining table was covered with a layer of glass. Occasionally, this glass was lifted to allow for the insertion of some new piece of national history, clipped from the morning paper, the last of which was the shocking notice, complete with photograph, that President Franklin Roosevelt had died suddenly in Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945. It was at this glass-covered table, my legs dangling from the seat of a clawfoot chair, that I first took note of design and invention. When my grandfather, Julius Carlson, announced to me in his high-pitched monotone that he had invented the adjustable cap. So I found this in a park in Berkeley about a month ago, and I kept it, of course. And it got lost at the wedding, but it was found for me by a faithful son. And this is a version of the adjustable cap, of which Julius Carlson, between 1921 and 1929, took out 4 patents. Some of them look rather like this, not exactly, and others are very different. But Julius spent almost the whole of his 91-year life fighting for the funds that came from those patents, and I think not getting a cent out of it. Yeah, and that all has to do with the age-old conflict between the man or woman who's hired to invent or design and actually gets the patent, and the company who has contracted him and is paying him to do the designing. What finally became of my grandfather's glass-topped cherry-wood table, as I stroked on a second coat of shellac, I supposed that I could track it down, but to what good? Restoring my own table had brought me to see it with the eyes of the past, as only a child can see it, and now that image would be mine forever. A few days later, when the finish had cured out, we carried Bill Baker's table out of the garage and set it down in the dining area, which looked east toward the kitchen counter and west toward a stand of Douglas fir. This was in the hills of Oregon. It was splendid. It completed the house as a family domain. As it stood in that spot for the next 25 years, offering food and cheer as 3 kids grew up and 3 cycles of dogs stretched out on a nearby carpet, listened to our friendly chatter as soothing music, or were troubled by sudden stridencies. I remember lots of kids banging their heads on that table. In my journal, I describe a scene from the mid-1980s when Ted, our youngest, was 4 years old and sitting at the oak table. This is April 23rd, 1987. Troubles with Anthony and Nicholas vanished in the magic of the 15th and Onyx parting. That's where I dropped them off. But Ted opened a new canto by refusing to go to his daycare. As he put it, boring. I dragged him there via indirect routes, including an elevator. I bet he's right. At his frenetic pace of growth, he has outgrown himself and needs some new challenge. After squabble number 1 this morning, he asked me over the cream of wheat, quote, "What is the future? Can I see it?" I told him only his mind could see it, and that he had to close his eyes. So he did, and I began trying to drum up Anthony as a big man, Nick as a big man, Teddy as a paterfamilias, with kids and a beloved wife. In those days, the oak table, situated as it was at the hub of our indoor activities, had become the center and symbol of family communication and sharing. It attracted and hosted the disorderly Grudin version of the tea ceremony. Its broad, square surface and rich brown texture created a human space that was always inviting, always available. Its waterproof skin accommodated hot cups and chilled glasses alike. Its ample center almost cried out for a turkey or birthday cake or major salad bowl. It certainly was in part the inspiration for the scores of richly glazed cups, plates, and bowls that my wife and soon Nick, too, turned out on the potter's wheel, on the deck, and fired at a local kiln. It faithfully fulfilled the purpose of an all-dining room furniture, facilitating and enriching human dialogue. I'm sorry I can't go on more with that section, which I must say gets rather sentimental. But there you have an idea that I think some designers have forgotten, and that is the idea of a piece of furniture that actually becomes a member of the family, and that is truly dialogic in terms of what it provides for the family. So I'll do one more section, and then we'll do Q of A. I'm now going to bring you up to September 2001 and 9/11. I've got 2 chapters of this book about 9/11. One of them is a rather complicated revisionist history of the World Trade Center from beginning to end. And the other one has to do with the psychiatric conference. Every year for the last 20 years, my wife Misha and I, Misha is a scholar with a talent for doing drama, or at least talking about it. We've been invited to a big psychiatric conference to talk about the plays that are put on at Ashland. And this conference was going to be on, I think, start on the 14th. I had already canceled our airline tickets, and we were going to drive down. But I'll introduce this because this is actually a chapter about psychological design that occurs in many different ways. How do we manage the private thoughts and pent-up emotions that are the inevitable legacy of our personal experiences? To some extent, we can regulate our private knowledge consciously, the way trainers control and train a dog. You know, like you're at a counter and you're mad at the server, or someone who's selling you a ticket and should be selling you the ticket and is doing something else. And you get angry, but you control it. But our inner energies are so volatile that conscious control inevitably proves inadequate. We can also try acting out our inner feelings, but expressing them converge on the antisocial and the chaotic. Our private knowledge is the resident spirit alive within us, inalienable and unquiet. And so here were a bunch of psychiatrists trying to manage their own private knowledge. On the morning of Saturday, September 15th, 2001, I sat in a committee room in Ashland, Oregon, with a group of about 20 psychiatrists. We were all in various stages of recovery from the events of 9/11, and they had asked me to join them in a kind of group therapy session. There were about 200 psychiatrists at the meeting. 20 of them were so upset. Well, I'm sure there were numbers so upset that they couldn't do anything. But 20 were so upset they got together and decided to do group therapy, and they asked me along. My role at the convention, where the doctors came annually, was to lecture on Shakespeare, not terrorism. How could I calm others when I was myself upset? What could I possibly say about trauma to 20 traumatized psychiatrists? And I'll summarize the next section. That's where Shakespeare came in. See, there are various events you can't stage, especially on a Shakespearean stage. You can do them in the movies, but you can't put them on a stage. And one of them comes from Hamlet, and that is the beautiful young noblewoman Ophelia going mad and drowning herself in a stream. Shakespeare couldn't do that at the time on stage, so he had someone describe it. And this is Queen Gertrude describing it. There is a willow grows aslant a brook that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. There with fantastic garlands did she come, of crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. The distraught girl comes down to the stream. She lies down or falls into it. She floats away down the stream, slowly drowning. Notice the way Shakespeare handles the precise details. Crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples. He's doing that to project the event into his audience's consciousness. But he's also doing something else. He's doing what I call the death story. And it's a story that we all have to know whenever we hear about the death of someone we care about. But it also occurred to me that the death narrative was more than just a stage tactic. It was a cross-cultural folk tradition, affecting us all and born of a universal psychological necessity. Whenever we hear that somebody important to us has died, we want to know about every possible detail. And whenever we are in control of the details, we feel obliged to pass them on to someone else who cares. The death narrative offers a kind of relief. It cannot curtail our mourning, but it can bring an otherwise intolerable truth into the realm of day-to-day reality. How did all of this relate to the psychiatrists on 9/11? That Saturday, when my turn came to speak, I spoke to them about narrative as a means of organizing reality. I put it to them that the first step in healing after a traumatic event is to construct a narrative that places the event within a rational context. A narrative allows the mind to couch the traumatic event in knowable terms. A narrative stabilizes an injured mind, much in the way a splint stabilizes a damaged limb. With this in mind, I suggested that they all find out as much as they could about 9/11 and construct narrative of their own. So just to go into a little more detail, I had learned about the trauma narrative from Shakespeare. That was the first thing. He had one reason for recounting a trauma narrative, but I saw that he was accessing an old folk tradition. And if you go back to this yourself, and you've heard about the death of a loved one, someone will feel compelled to tell you every detail that she or he knows. And you will feel compelled to listen to the details because that person, until that moment, has been alive to you. And you can't just rip that person out of your consciousness. You need a narrative. In the same way, it is theorized, a traumatized person who, say, has been attacked, even if it's long ago, can be encouraged to form a narrative of that attack, of its reasons, and of its details. The narrative, again, this is the theory, the narrative has the effect of stabilizing the damaged part of the brain so that the rest of healing can begin. And the funny thing is that that a lot of us are so traumatized that we try to suppress or conceal that narrative from ourselves. And I can assure you that doing that keeps the pain alive rather than heals it. Anyway, when I had this idea completely on my own, thanks to Shakespeare, So when I got home, I found out what was the most famous book on the subject. In case you're interested, it probably is still the most famous book. It's called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman of Harvard University. And I was incredibly relieved when Judith Herman, I opened the book, I looked up a narrative, she said the exact same thing I had. Boy, am I smart. Herman has gotten into a lot of trouble, by the way, by taking people back into their early traumatic days and finding some scapegoat. Daddy spanked me that day, and I've never been the same since. I hurt for a long time. I'm hurting now. So there are a lot of anguished parents who were very angry at Judith Herman. But on the other hand, I consider most of her ideas in that book extremely solid, and I support them. This chapter, by the way, goes through a number of other ways in which the mind unconsciously designs things that it needs. There is the dream, for example. And there's also the memory. And there's also what we call subjectivity. And that's when we have just a very few pieces of evidence, and our mind unconsciously creates a line between those dots. You have a piece of evidence that someone was murdered, and another piece of evidence that somebody was very mad at her and saying bad things. Those are two dots. And like some detective, you connect the dots. Well, maybe it was that person who murdered the other person. Now, that's subjective. That can become a hypothesis for a journalist or a detective. It could be right or it could be wrong. But it's a kind of unconscious, instantaneous design that we do. I'll give you a couple of examples of design memories. And one example is from President Woodrow Wilson. He's always felt that his first memory was of a man riding up to his house in the Southeast, jumping off his horse and telling his dad that the Civil War had begun. This would have been 1861. Wilson would have been just beyond a toddler, maybe 7 years old. Now, that might have been his earliest retained memory, but I doubt it. And the reason I doubt it is that it was Woodrow Wilson who brought us into the next Great War so many years later. So his mind was unconsciously choosing the memory that most accorded with the great act of his life. There's another one I can't help telling you, and with that I'm going to conclude. And that is that I knew a guy once, very briefly, whose name was Cornelius Bull, B-U-L-L. And Cornelius Bull was a very well-known Middle Eastern hand, so to speak. He was one of those Americans who went forth into a foreign country for his career and did major things. The major things that Neil Bull did included founding English-speaking schools in the Middle East. Now, Neil Bull had control of the invitations to a fairly prestigious speaking engagement that went on every year, was founded by some big construction firm in Istanbul. So I was brought out to Istanbul by Neil, who was a character if you have ever met one. And I gave a talk about the origins of creativity. I had just written a book about creativity. The origins of creativity, sometimes having to do with childhood experience. And my talk was simultaneously translated to a couple of hundred people who couldn't speak English. It's translated almost simultaneously into Turkish. It was a great big long room. And the room was so poorly designed that I couldn't keep my my attention on my speech almost. I was thinking about how a room could be, a public room could be that badly designed. But anyway, as soon as I could, I asked for Q&A. And what I asked for was for people to share their first memories with me. So Neil Bull's hand went up first. And at that time, he was a man in his middle 60s. He said, "Oh, 60 years ago, my father took me to the zoo. And we walked around looking at animals. I had a wonderful view. And because I was sitting on my father's shoulders, he was holding me by the legs. And he took me to the elephant pen. There was this great elephant there. It came up to see us. It stuck up its trunk to get a peanut. So there's this huge trunk coming out of the little kid. My father handed me up a peanut to give to the elephant. And I reached out my little arm, but just at the moment when I was about to put it in the elephant's snout, just as my father told me to do, there was the snout right in front of me. I froze. I pulled my arm back, and the moment I did that, the elephant raised its snout and batted me on the head. That was his earliest memory. Well, Neil Bull was one of the braver guys I've met. And for him to tell this early memory about his own early trauma at the hands or snout of an elephant, it was just too much like Neil Bull. I'm sure that wasn't his earliest memory, but it's the most amusing earliest memory I've ever heard. In any case, the mind builds. When the mind goes back to memories, it does some designing. It does some building. Because what it has to put together, again, is little dots of data that it retains. Same thing happens when you wake up from a dream. Generally, you have little dots of data and you're lying in bed and you're thinking, I've got to remember this dream. And so your mind is unconsciously putting it together into a story. I'm afraid that's all the time I have to talk, and I'd love to field a couple of questions from you. Steve.
Yeah, the central sort of thesis of the book is that I'm trying to use this thing for the. Gotta make sure it picks up on YouTube. So the thesis of the book is design is truth, and that good design tells the truth, bad design tells a lie. And that actually usually has to do with the abuse of power. And I wonder if you could give us an example of, maybe from the book or elsewhere, of a design that told a lie and how that reflected an abuse of power in one way or another.
I believe I can think of one, and that brings me back to my other 9/11 story. You see, when they were building the World Trade Center, it was a huge project, as you all know. And it was originally conceived because of money. And it was also built in the sense that it would earn enormous amounts of money. It was conceived because David Rockefeller, who was a big deal banker, got the idea that he could revivify commerce in lower Manhattan by building a trade center, something that would simply draw in a lot of traffic. It wasn't for 20 years that they started the competition in which the architects were chosen. Yamasaki was a good and very successful architect. He was also Japanese American. And to my mind, he was never fully sure of his American identity. And one of the things he did, or he designed for himself in his own mind to affirm his own identity, was to become a kind of citizen of the world, an internationalist. Anyway, he had his firm do at least 100 models of the World Trade Center. And there was some pretty good stuff. He ended up with a complex that would fill the available acreage with an 80-story skyscraper and a number of other large buildings around it. Now, if you look south at Lower Manhattan, you'll see 3 or 4 buildings, some of them from the early 30s, that go up 70, 60, 70, 80 stories. An 80-story skyscraper might have added very nicely to the profile of Lower New York. But the Port Authority, even though they had already chosen Yamasaki, weren't satisfied with 80 stories. What they wanted was something like 10 million square feet of office space in 2 buildings. And I don't know how many of you remember the World Trade Center. It's 1,350 feet tall, 110 stories. Every story in each of those 2 buildings was an acre, 200 by 200. That's why the buildings looked so, in a sense, nightmarish, because they were not only very tall, but they were very, very thick. They were very wide on every side. Now, what that means is that the majority of people who are working on any given floor are an average of, what would it be, 75 feet, 60 feet away from the nearest window. On top of that, Yamasaki, who himself had acrophobia, made the windows so small that you couldn't even notice the windows from a distance. As I say in the book, the World Trade Center, which had the world's best view, was legally blind itself. What Yamasaki did, what he had to do, was make an uncomfortable compromise with his clients. And he created a set of buildings which, in the end, told a lie. And here's the lie. If you look at a building like the Chrysler Building, or the old RCA Building, or the Lever Building, you're looking at a concept that was humanistically designed. It was designed to give the individual a sense that even though he was working in a very large building, there was something about that building that justified the work. There was something beautiful, there was something human, there was something that gave vent to the individual's aspirations. With the World Trade Center, Yamasaki was forced to go too far. The World Trade Center was not, in a sense, justifying. It didn't justify the individual. It belittled the individual in the same sense that it belittled the other skyscrapers. As I put it in the book, it stood out in the vernacular of Lower Manhattan like a pair of hurled expletives. Expletives not deleted, well, until the end, of course. Yamasaki's story goes on because there were other lies in the course of the development of the building. New York code required 6 escape routes for buildings of that size. The Port Authority cut them to 3. The 3 escape routes were intertwined all the way up to the top of the building. These were the staircases. Had there been 6 escape routes, you would have probably had, now I want each of you to become an architect, you probably would have had 1 at each of the 4 corners of each building, and then 2 intertwined down the middle. That's the logical approach. If that had happened, there would have been at least a couple of escape routes available to the people above the crash zones when the crash occurred. But instead, the Port Authority limited them to 3, and they were wound down the middle of the building, As it turned out, after the crashes, there was only one open escape route. It was only partly open, and only 17 people escaped down it. Everyone else above the crash zone died. There's another lie attached to it, and this is really amazing. Most people feel chills up their spines when they hear this one. Yamasaki had done major work with the bin Laden family, so that when Osama bin Laden was a little boy in the 1960s, he clearly, we have no evidence on this because the Yamasaki family and his firm have shut up tight about it. But the probability is that he, as a child, got to know that Yamasaki was rebuilding Saudi America along Western lines. And what Yamasaki loved to do was he loved to take Islamic patterns and mix them with modern architectural design. From my perspective, and I must share with you that I'm designing this story myself, Yamasaki became a kind of Darth Vader for young bin Laden. Bin Laden studied architecture and engineering in Jeddah, and it was during his own restoration of some sacred Islamic sites that he underwent his conversion to fundamental Islam. So just imagine the complex relationship between Osama bin Laden and the World Trade Center, and you're imagining a lot. One more point, and this is how I started writing the entire article. I saw photographs, those unforgettable photographs of the fallen buildings with the metal tracework still going up 4 stories. And it suddenly occurred to me, those were Islamic arches. Some people call them Persian arches because Persia influenced early Islamic art. And it turned out that, again, I was lucky. My conception was justified by the architectural experts and also by Yamasaki's own autobiography. He had deliberately built Islamic sacred language into the formation of the square, the shape of the buildings, and the Islamic tracework going down it. Now, I'll tell you, from the research I've done into Islam, that is a no-no. You don't quote Islamic sacred imagery in any way that would demean it. Whether you're putting it in a song or in a novel, the way Salman Rushdie did, or in architecture, it's blasphemy. I don't think Yamasaki knew that. But what he was trying to do, because he was Yamasaki, is he was trying to, again, in my opinion, he was trying to justify his own originality as an architect and as a human being in the face of an embarrassing compromise that he had had to make with the World Trade Center. So there is design, and it turned into another lie when he, in his autobiography, said, "The World Trade Center is a testament to the common man." It justifies his existence, etc. Lie, 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 so far as I was concerned. And that's how I wrote it down. Thank you very much. We ended a bit late. Thank you.